all his fault. And I also want to thank Dr. Moore.
And if it's wonderful, who gets the credit?
It's all me.
Okay.
No. If it's so wonderful, I'll thank everybody that
You
participated.
take advice from Daryl?
Yes, I take advice from Daryl.
You realize the dean sent me here to make sure that we made a good hire.
Right,
Oh,
yeah.
well,
So he's waiting on mine,
On the thumbs up or thumbs down.
I thought you
Okay.
got yours out of the way, Daryl.
And,
Yeah, that's
What are you doing, taping this?
Yeah, I just realized there is a video capability
video
in this
capability.
tablet, so, well, whatever it does, it does. I've never used it before, so
Make sure you get his video released.
I'm just gonna make a copy and hand it to him. I'm not doing anything with
Why
this.
don't you go put it on YouTube?
There's
I wanna
enough
thank
weird
Dr.
stuff
Moore
on
also
YouTube.
for coming down from Albuquerque to be here as well. So, my dissertation topic was teaching marketing ethics to undergraduate students. And surprisingly enough, there is not, is this going to work? Oh, wrong one. There's not a lot of work that's been done in actual effective pedagogy. Most of the work that's been done in marketing ethics is focused on attitudes and behaviors of practitioners or students, differences between students in marketing or in business and non-business, but not a lot that's been done in terms of actually effectively developing a curriculum to teach ethics to undergraduate students. The one exception to that is the Hunt and Levery paper that uses MBA level students in an experimental design to teach marketing ethics. And I think that perhaps MBA students are a bit different, particularly if you're talking about executive MBA education where they've already got some practical real-world experience as opposed to undergraduates who are unlikely to have very much familiarity with actual business situations. And so my purpose in doing this was to test case studies, and I got the idea for this in talking with Dr. Hyman, and then also in talking with some former colleagues at the University of Central Oklahoma in terms of what is it that undergraduates can understand in terms of case studies. So sort of the traditional case studies in ethics or in business education are the Enrons, the WorldComs, Tyco, AIG, the Bernie Madoffs, and those I think are not necessarily cases that undergraduate students can relate to. They're also sort of not interesting from the perspective of they're the duh cases. You read about Bernie Madoff and you just kind of have to think, you would have to have the ethical sensitivity of a jellyfish, since Dr. Sauter just came back from Mexico, to not understand that this is not a good idea, right? So I tried to develop more subtle cases and to test that, and to test whether or not there's a difference, and also to test whether or not there's an impact by training students in sort of fundamentals of logic and critical thinking, and if that has an impact on their ability to recognize ethical arguments that were made in a case. So my dissertation is organized beginning with the introduction, which I sort of did, then the literature review, which I broke into 4 parts: the development of marketing and business ethics theory, literature concerning students' attitudes about marketing ethics, pedagogy in ethics, and the use of experiential learning and the case study method in particular, and then critiques of experiential learning and the case method. In chapter 3, I present my hypotheses. I have in hypothesis 1 4 subparts to the hypothesis, and then hypotheses 2, 3, 4, and 5. Chapter 4, my study design, and 5, I discuss the analysis and results, and then in chapter 6, my conclusions, implications for managers, limitations, and future research that I would like to undertake as part of this. So, development in marketing ethics, there are 538 articles that have been identified, and sort of in the general framework, there's sort of the theory building models. The Hunt and Vitale model is one that's well known in marketing ethics, and so the early literature sort of focuses on that theory development and model building. And then it wasn't until the 1970s that you saw interest in marketing ethics and education and pedagogy. And most of those studies then focused on student attitudes and perceptions of marketing ethics and the need for teaching marketing ethics. There was a divergence in the literature between business students' attitudes towards ethics and non-business students. And so that was one of the things that I tested using a different test than anybody else had used, at least so far as I knew. The other tests used the DIT. I used the EPQ to test whether or not there was a divergence between marketing majors and non-marketing majors or non-business majors. So early literature identified that there was this sort of split. Non-business majors tended to be more ethically absolutist in their perspectives, and business students had a tendency, and marketing students had a tendency to be more relativistic in their perspectives. Pedagogy and marketing ethics, Hunt and Levery and Yu and Donfu both advocate the use of experiential learning using case studies. And so Hunt and Levery used a presentation of their model, or the Hunt and Vitale model, in their MBA class, and then followed it up with a case that they said that executive MBA students were likely to have familiarity with, discussing the model as it applied to the case study, and then discussing it. Shigen argues that, and I talked about this in the proposal defense, that experiential learning and the case study methods are inefficient ways of teaching business education. The case study method came into business education largely as a result of the movement at Harvard, where they had a dean that came from the law school and became dean of the College of Business, and his familiarity with the case method and teaching legal education was then implemented, and the Harvard case study method has become widely used in businesses, in colleges of business since that time. And Shigen actually argues that because the technical skills that students need to develop in substantive courses are not necessarily well suited to the case study method, that what you ought to engage in is sort of a lecture style format where you feed students an enormous amount of content and then test them on their substantive ability to deal with that content. And I sort of argue that that may be appropriate for a course like accounting, where it is actual technical skills, but a case like marketing ethics, it's more appropriate to use the case study method. The hypotheses. So hypothesis 1 is 4 parts, and what it looks at, the EPQ has 2 scales. It has a relativism scale and an idealism scale. And so hypothesis 1 deals with those scales and looking at differences between marketing majors and non-business majors, and then differences between marketing students early on in their marketing education and students sort of later on in their marketing career. So the class that I taught that compares it with early on students, I used a principles of marketing class that I taught, and then I used 2 courses that I taught marketing ethics. And in both of those marketing ethics courses, the students had to be seniors and fairly close to graduation in order to take the course. Principles of marketing is required for all of our courses at UCO before they can take any other course in marketing. So the principles course was a good example of students that have very little knowledge, maybe have only had introductory to business, but not had any real marketing courses. And then I used only those students in the principles course that were going to be marketing, that identified themselves as marketing majors. So I didn't include in that the accounting, the management, the finance majors, and people like that. Why is the scale, or why are the scales important, and why is hypothesis 1 important? The 2x2 matrix that Forsyth comes up with in the EPQ goes from high to low on relativism and high to low on idealism. Low scores of idealism and high scores of relativism correspond with subjectivism. And in the philosophical ethics literature, subjectivism is a challenge. It's presented as a challenge to ethics and not actually a valid ethical theory. It's one of those theories that's intuitively appealing, though. Subjectivism says that, really only I can decide for myself what is ethics, and it's sort of emotive and based on what I feel, emotion. It denies that there are any a priori truths. And to give you an example of this, I was listening to NPR the other day, and in an area that's going to affect the transportation, or not, the tourism and travel industry, the National Transportation Safety Board has issued a promulgated rule to lower the DUI limit from .08 to .05. When my boss at UCO started practicing law, the legal limit for alcohol consumption was .15. That was lowered to .10, and then under Clinton's administration, he pushed for the .08 standard to be imposed. If the National Transportation Safety Board promulgates the rule, it will impact states' highway funds. They will lose highway funds should they not lower the limit from .08 to .05. The Restaurant Association and National Hotel and Motel Association have all come out against the lowering of the limit from .08 to .05. And I'm using this as my example of how subjectivism is so intuitively attractive. So if we went around the room, I would venture to guess that nobody's in favor of drunk driving, right? I mean, MAD has convinced us that that's a bad thing, right? But interestingly enough, Mothers Against Drunk Driving is not in favor of the rule. They're not in favor of lowering it from .08 to .05. Isn't that sort of interesting? .05 is the legal limit in all of Europe, right? But the restaurants and bars are absolutely going crazy over this rule, and they say that it will absolutely impact their ability to market alcohol consumption, right? Drink specials and things like that. So one of the cases that I have in the course deals with drink specials, across the street from a college campus. So I thought that promulgation of that rule was kind of interesting. And I would imagine that there's a wide variety of opinion as to whether or not we should limit the alcohol consumption to .08. Does anybody have any idea what .08 would be?
Like one beer, or it depends
It would
for
be
men
one
and women.
beer for me.
Right.
It would be
for men and
nothing
women.
for you, right? I mean, almost nothing. One glass of wine would put you over the .08 limit. Probably. It depends on how fast your body metabolizes alcohol.
Right.
But based on a rough estimate of
Right.
what the Hotel and Restaurant Association have come up with in terms of their ideas.
Why would MAD object to the law?
MAD objects because they don't think that it will substantively impact deaths by alcohol consumption. They're much more interested in promulgating rules that require individuals, which, by the way, drunk driving laws have nothing to do with public safety at this point, because we could absolutely end DUI, right? I mean, we have the technology. It's called slap an interlocking device on every vehicle in America. And that's what MAD wants to do. They're much more interested in promulgating a rule that says every car has to have an interlocking device on it. And that would end drunk driving.
So going back to, I guess where I was unclear is the point you were trying to make about this whole story with
Subjectivism.
regards to subjectivism.
I think it's intuitively appealing because if we can't even get MAD on board with something that seems as objectively hard and fast as drunk driving, we could find a wide variety of opinion with regard to students' attitudes and drinking. I think because of social desirability bias, no student is going to say drinking and driving is good, right? But the limit between .08, I mean, you'd think that would be one of those things that we could all agree on, and not even MAD is willing to step up and start supporting that. And so subjectivism is sort of intuitively appealing, but it's fundamentally based on emotion and not on logic and critical thinking. And so it's presented in all of the philosophy literature as being a challenge to ethics, and it's actually one of the ones that's easiest to dispense with, but yet it seems to be one that students actually continually engage in. So that low idealism score, high relativism score corresponds with a more subjectivist perspective.
Grant, wouldn't you think that, as you say,
We just lost Dave.
Whoop,
Uh-oh, all right.
Probably heard you were gonna lower the limit on alcohol.
yeah.
Yeah,
Understandable.
he's already over the limit. He can't be driving a computer well.
It's dialing, so do you want to,
Oh, yes, so subjective, now surely in an issue such as ethics, there's a degree of subjectivism for everyone, of course. And you mentioned it's based on emotions, yet a lot of the literature in psychology and sociology shows the best way to move people into action is through the emotions, rather than factual information.
Yeah, that is, there's actually some really interesting research being done by a cultural anthropologist who looks at the ethics of capuchin monkeys and bonobos. And so what he's done is he's done this experiment, and it turns out that capuchin monkeys actually exhibit something that we might think of as being ethics in terms of, it's a raw emotional response to a perceived injustice or fairness, right? So what he does is he does this experiment where he gives the monkey a tool that they have to then hand back to him through a cage, and if they do that, they get a treat. And so he has two treats. He's got cucumbers in one and apples. And so he gives the first monkey a cucumber. The monkey is perfectly happy with the cucumber and eats the cucumber. He goes to the next monkey that the first monkey can see, gives it the tool, the monkey hands the tool back to him, he gives it an apple. The first monkey's now seen this. Now you go back to the first monkey, you get it to hand you back the tool, and he gives it a cucumber. And if you watch the video, it's really funny. I mean, the monkey becomes absolutely incensed and throws the cucumber at the researcher, right? But that's raw emotion. I would suggest that, yes, there is a degree of subjectivity to it, but I'm not really willing to say that maybe when we're dealing with complex financial transactions that we should be equating capuchin monkeys with human beings in business.
Yeah, when it comes to emotions, a lot of people behave according to social validation. And you look at other individuals and see what their ethics or their beliefs are in this case. But a lot of that gets into emotion, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that there is a fair amount of emotion. But from a philosophical standpoint, I think that most philosophers argue using a modus ponens type argument that the further you get from emotion and into rational action, the better or the safer you are in terms of making correct ethical decisions.
Could I make a process suggestion? Because I had some questions along those lines. That maybe those questions we hold to a question period?
Probably a good point, yeah. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
We'll
It's
do it
okay.
again, promise.
Stand in the corner, just like I
Clarification,
make
I think, is
Evan.
okay.
Stand in the corner,
In the corner?
in the corner.
I live in the corner, I'm there all the time at home. Mars puts me in the corner every chance. Dogs do too.
Hypothesis 2 looks at testing the instruction in logic and critical thinking and its ability to enhance students' ability to identify ethical arguments and from a philosophical perspective. The way the experiment worked was in ME1, I introduced logic and critical thinking at the beginning of the semester before we began discussing ethical philosophy. And in ME2, I introduced logic and critical thinking halfway through the semester and began the semester with a discussion on philosophical ethics from a business perspective. Initially, when I had made my proposal, I had wanted to totally separate the two experimental groups so that one received the treatment in logic and critical thinking and the other didn't. But the IRB had a fit here at New Mexico State with denial of a benefit to one group that you weren't giving to another. And so I do recognize that there may be a confounding impact here, but that was not of my own making. That was and UCO's IRB agreed with them and then wanted to be even more restrictive to suggest that I couldn't even run the experiments. So that's why I did it that way. And then